All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us today. Today, we are hosting a webinar titled Human Rights, Ethics, and the Importance of Evidence-Based Research. This is part of an ongoing webinar series on science, technology, and human rights. This is co-sponsored by the Science Human Rights Coalition of the American Advancement for Science and George Mason University's Social Movement Research Hub of the Center for Social Science Research. I'll be your host today. My name is John Dale, and I'm Director of Movement Engaged. And I'll begin by introducing our panelists. We have three today. Kristen Renwick Monroe, who's a Distinguished Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine and founding director of its Ethics Center. She has over 22 books on politics, ethics, and psychology, and is best known for her award-winning trilogy on altruism and moral choice. She'll be followed by Manisha Gelman, who's Associate Professor of Political Science in the Marlborough Institute for Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts. Her research spans human rights, democratization, and education politics around the globe. And moderating today will be Anne-Marie Clark, Professor of Political Science at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. She's published a number of articles and books on international human rights, ideas, and law in international politics, and the work of non-governmental actors in fostering human rights change at the global level. Today, our panelists will be addressing the question, what is the role of science in work on ethics and human rights? We'll go for about 40 minutes as our panelists present their work and try to wrestle with this question. And then we'll save about the last 20 minutes or so for questions and answers, and we'll invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A. We will take those up as they emerge, so you can ask questions as we're going, but we won't interrupt the panelists until the end of the 40 minutes. So with that, I'll hand things over to Anne-Marie.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers, both at GMU and at AAAS. And one thing I would mention is that we panelists are all political scientists, so we're coming at it from the perspective of political science and human rights. And I would say we're only partially representative of all the political scientists who do research on human rights, but we were invited through our national organization, the American Political Science Association. We're part of the section on human rights, and Manisha Gelman of Emerson College is the president of the section right now. And we were asked to have Manisha say just a little bit about the human rights section of APSA before we get going. So Manisha.
Thanks so much, Anne and John, and to all the organizers. It's great to be together, even in this virtual format where I can't see who the participants are, but thank you for making time in your day to be together with us. The human rights section of the American Political Science Association it's one of 50+ sections that organization has. APSA is I believe it's the largest political science convening globally, and there's I think there's more than 10,000 members. We come together in these massive conferences of 4,000 to 6,000 people in any given year. And the section is a specific space for people who want to focus on human rights in some aspect of their work. So many of us that are part of the section also do other things. So I'm a comparative political scientist, but I'm comparing things that have to do with human rights. So I was going to ask Karthik if he was able to drop the links to some of the section resources that I had put in the chat that the panelists can see so they can be available to everyone. And I will admit that our section websites they're not the most up to date. They're not the most maintained. The rarely used social media disclaimer there is because I think both our Facebook and our Twitter site are quite out of date. But as we move closer to the September APSA conference. We'll be updating those. The APSA Connect page, though, and the description of the section do show the awards that we annually create committees to adjudicate. And it's really a specific community that wants to have intentional conversations about different aspects of human rights within our discipline, but many of us, including myself, operate in interdisciplinary spaces where we are in interdisciplinary departments or we're involved in interdisciplinary conversations. So the section is one of many ways we can be intentional about the kinds of research and scholarly conversations that we want to be involved in, as well as some of the practitioner concerns that come up in our work. So if people have questions about the section, by all means reach out to us at the section, and happy to discuss that. And otherwise I'll hand it back to Anne and Kristen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the format today Kristen will talk for a little bit about her work, and then Manisha will also present some reflections from her research. And we feel like, although we do very different things, one of the common threads is the ways that actually looking at evidence in political science can lead to counterintuitive findings and ideas for further inquiry that we might not have thought of without examining, empirically what's going on. And so Kristen's going to lead us off, and she, true to her title of distinguished professor, is a distinguished human rights scholar. And Kristen is going to talk a little bit about her work on how people respond to human rights violations. I'll put that very generally, and then Kristen, I'll let you define and introduce your topic. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. This timing of this webinar couldn't be better because it's desperately needed. I think that there's a quote that I put up on the screen in the first PowerPoint, if you can pull that up. It's a quote by Carl Sagan. It says, "If we can't think for ourselves, if we're unwilling to question authority, then we're just putty in the hands of," and my screen is not letting me read all the quote, but I can't have it here. "If we can't think for ourselves, if we are unwilling to question authority, then we're just putty in the hands of those in power. But if the citizens are educated and form their own opinions, then those in power work for us. In every country, we should be teaching our children the scientific method and the reason for a Bill of Rights. With it comes a certain decency, humility, and community spirit. In the demon-haunted world that we inhabit by virtue of being human, this may be all that stands between us and the enveloping darkness." And that's a very dramatic quote, but I think we're in a situation now where if you look at politics, we have people in our country, huge numbers of them are not sure who the president is. There are some people who are saying it's Donald Trump. Some people say it's Joe Biden. We have climate deniers. We have people who literally died because they did not believe that the COVID vaccine would work for them, or taking medication. So this is a time where, more than ever before, I think we need to think about how we determine the validity of conflicting claims, often, broadcast by news agencies that are claiming impartiality and that produce dramatically different presentation of the same basic facts. So one of the problems with this is, yes, you can take down the slide. One of the problems is in teaching students about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work, and I tend to think of teaching as being very cohabiting with research. So the first project that I want to talk about is one that I did on altruism. I started out as trained as a rational choice theorist at the University of Chicago. I did econometric modeling of presidential popularity in the economy. And then I did what you're really supposed to do when you finish a project. I stepped back to look at the larger picture, and I realized that a lot of our models that we were doing were just the changes that we were debating. Is it, do people vote sociotropically in terms of, or do they, for other people, or do they vote in terms of pocketbooks? Were largely a function of the models we were using. And the dominant model in social science, and certainly political science, which is my home discipline, was a rational choice model, which is a powerful assumption. It says that if you want to understand how human beings operate, they operate on the basis of their self-interest according to how they perceive it. And it's kind of like a blinding light. It's such a powerful tool because there is so much empirical validity behind it that it can blind you to those parts of life that do not operate that way. And one of them was altruism. And I thought, there's altruism and then there's collective behavior, which is what much of politics is. And I tend to be a tidy person. So I thought, well, I'll look at altruism because there's less of that. And then I'll go on to collective behavior. And that was in 1988. And I'm still looking at altruism because what I found when I started looking at it, I'd done all the reading. I took a year and a half and just read every thing I could find on altruism. And I had it pretty well figured out. I knew what it was going to be. And then I thought, well, I'll look at it empirically. And it turned out everything I read was wrong. It was just misleading. And so I started doing interviews with people. I interviewed entrepreneurs as kind of baseline data for people who take an idea and try to make it into something that will further their self-interest. I then looked at philanthropists. I had a kind of continuum that moved towards pure altruists. I had philanthropists because they give away a lot of money, but they still keep some. And then I had people who were recipients of the Carnegie Hero Commission Award. These were people who are not firemen or policemen. They're not paid to help other people, but they do things like running into a burning building, jumping into a lake to save someone. And about a third of the awards are actually given posthumously. So people actually do sometimes die trying to perform these things. The last group of people I looked at were people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. And that was in some ways the most interesting group because unlike the Carnegie Hero Commission people, it was more than a one-shot activity. Sometimes it was just a one-shot thing, but often it meant having people in your home for years. And you didn't have enough food, you didn't have enough medicine for them. And if you were caught, it was not just you that were killed, it was your whole family. So I started talking to these people and asking them, well, how did you make a decision to do it? And what I found is that they just kept laughing at me. And I really had to pull myself out of my own paradigm and try to rethink something because one of the women I interviewed was an interesting one. Her name was Margot. She's a little tiny person. She was German. Her dad was head of General Motors for Europe, Western Europe, so very well known. And they left Germany in protest when Hitler came and went to Holland. And then she was in the unenviable position when the Germans took over Holland of being someone who was on record as not liking Hitler. She had two daughters. She had a husband she divorced because she said, oh, I caught the bum coming out of the maid's room in the morning, pulling his pants up. And I just divorced the bum. She told me that very casually, and then I found out later she tried to kill herself. So it's very interesting to do these human interviews, and we can talk about that later, about some of the ethical issues involved there. She had an affair with the Gestapo commander of Amsterdam in order to get information, and after the war she had him killed. So she was a real tough lady. And she kept saying to me, what are you crazy? People don't operate like that. You don't sit down and say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which am I going to do? And she said, there's just nothing you can do. There's no choice to make. And so that was one of the things that struck me, that the whole literature, the whole body of literature on rational choice assumes that people sit down and consciously make a kind of cost-benefit calculus. And that was not what these people were saying at all. And then the other thing that was interesting is that there's a whole tradition in Western philosophy, theater, and art, you have the idea of the hero who's trying to make a decision, and he paces the floor during the night, and as the sun comes up in the east, he decides to do the right thing, or he doesn't decide to do the right thing and he fails. And so the whole concept of agonistic choice, which is so prominent in Western culture, didn't work for these people. And what we found instead was that the way they saw each other, saw themselves in relation to other people, really both set and delineated the range of choice options they found, not just morally, but cognitively. They literally did not see that something was there. So for example, we came up today on my computer, and my computer decided it didn't want to let me be seen. And so I don't have the choice. I'm just sitting here with and you have a picture of me and I'm a voice. It wasn't an option on my computer. It's like going into an Italian restaurant and saying, you want to have, egg foo young or some Chinese dish. It's not on the menu. And so you have to understand how people see each other. And then, so I explored this work in a couple of books, The Heart of Altruism, The Hand of Compassion. The joke in my family was that my books had to have body parts in them before they did well. But then I had Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, where I looked to see whether or not bystanders and perpetrators of a genocide had the same kind of process. And it turns out they do, that bystanders see themselves as people who are very weak. It's not that they sit down and decide they don't want to do it. It's just they don't think that it's relevant for them. That they're very low on what philosophers call agency. I'm not someone who counts. I don't have any, there's nothing I could do. And the phrases that I kept getting from the rescuers, and some of the people I interviewed were related to the rescuers. One woman was a cousin and had been raised by Tony's mother. Tony was a rescuer, and he said, but what else can you do? They're human beings like you and me. You can't turn away from them. And his cousin said, but what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis. And so it's a very powerful lack of choice, but very different perceptions of themselves. And then the Nazis, and that's another whole issue we can talk about, interviewing those people. That was kind of a trip and a half. There was a woman, she's still a Nazi. She still believes in all of this. And she was married to one of the top Dutch Nazis. She was powerful in the women's movement herself. And she said her perception of Jews, Gypsies, Social Democrats was that they were outside the community of concern. They were like cockroaches that we would kill because they're going to infect the good body politic of the German Republic. And so it's very much what I found basically was that I had to throw away a lot of what I learned, because when I went out empirically and asked real people about things, I got something totally different. The second example I'm going to use is one when I was doing the course on I was finishing the Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide. I like to teach it so I know whether or not I've got the book right, and I can see how the students respond to it. So I said I do a seminar on Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, which is what the book was going to be called. And I went in to pick up talking to a copy of the reading list, and the secretary in the department said, do you want a book for your TAs? And I said, I don't know TAs, it's just a small course. And she said, it's a 70-person course and there's a waiting list a mile long. So I had to try to figure out how to do this course that I wanted to do as a seminar with a lot of people in it. And what I ended up doing was I wanted to show them what war is like, not from the kind of strategic point of view, which is what we usually teach in political history and political science, but rather what it really feels like. So I said, I want you to find somebody who's lived through a war, do an interview with them, ask them what their war was like, and ask them about the moral choices they had to confront and how they kept their humanity, or how they saw other people's keeping their humanity. And I thought that the kids would probably do, this was in the early 90s, around 2000, I guess, when I did this. And I thought that the kids would do something in Iraq. And it turns out, because Irvine is a very multi-ethnic campus, that I had people who had a great-grandmother who had been in the Armenian genocide. The woman was 6 years old when she saw her grandfather have his head chopped off, and she ran out and took his his Bible, which he wouldn't give up, and it has his blood on it. So she came and she talked about the course. I had people whose parents had fled Idi Amin, people from the Central America, from the Lebanese Civil War, Afghanistan, all over the world. And the papers were so interesting. I said, you know, we should really put these together into a little book of some kind, if anybody's interested in working on it with me. So we did that. And it was actually one of the kids who came to the course. He heard that that we were talking about the Armenian genocide. So he wasn't even in the course, but he wanted to work with me on the book. So we had a bunch of people that worked on it. And what we found out there, again, were some surprising findings. One of the things that you think about in life is that if you're in control, that you you do well. We try to plan ahead. We try to anticipate things. This doesn't work out real well during a war. So we found out that people who are high on the need for control don't do very well. They kind of fall apart. And it was interesting to me because I was watching this as my mother was in her 90s and had been totally in charge of everything and couldn't do it anymore. And it was very frustrating for her. And so we found that fatalism was more important than having a sense of control. And one of the things that fatalism is, a lot of people use the same phrases even, oh hell, oh my God, they're shooting at me. Oh well, hell, what the heck, what difference does it make? I'm just going to go ahead and not worry about it too much. So that was just another example of what we we came excuse me, we came up with. So let me just, those are just two examples from my work. There are a lot of other types of work I could mention, but I was asked to focus mostly on my own. And I'm happy to talk about any of the questions in a question and answer period. So I wanted to talk a little bit just before we close about institution building and how you teach about this. So one of the things I've done, because I set up the Ethics Center at UCI, and it's an interdisciplinary center. The long title is the UCI Interdisciplinary Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Morality, which is a horrible title, but that's what we basically do. We try to take methods that are scientific. So we have Brian Skirms, who's a very distinguished game theorist, does a lot of work on cooperation, and what he found there was not what the usual literature comes up with. We have social psychologists such as Peter Ditto, works with Jonathan Haidt on things like disgust and how people, are there any basic things that people do ethically throughout different times and cultures. So what we have ended up doing is we had a mentoring program where a bunch of students started out just simply, a couple people came to me and wanted to work, do some work on ethics, and I accommodated them. I was happy to do it, but it got so big, we had 40 people, and I had to hire some graduate students to get these students involved in their work. And then when the COVID came, we went online, and I thought, well, this may kill the program, but in fact, it's worldwide. So last year we had 450 students in it. We don't charge anything. We do have to charge a small processing fee for people who apply, but we basically take everybody and we try to get them involved in research with different people so they can actually see what it's like to do research. And I was very proud of one of the kids. He was they're mostly high school kids at this point. And he gave the convocation at his school, and he talked about the importance of failing and how sometimes failure is good. It means you can still go on, everything's okay. But you also learned about what's important. And I told him I thought that was interesting. He said, I got that from you, Professor Monroe. So we try to involve them in our work. We have a book actually coming out in June, which is called Politics, Principle, and Standing Up to Donald Trump, Moral Courage in the Republican Party. The kids worked really hard. They wanted to do some more research. I did a book on moral courage that they saw how you do the research there. They said, well, maybe we can look at the Republicans that are standing up to Trump. And so we have interviews with people like Anthony Scaramucci and Rick Wilson of the Lincoln Project. And I was proud of it because the kids sometimes initiated this, so that a kid who's now he was a senior when I worked with him. He's now at Columbia, and he wrote to Rick Wilson to see if we could get an interview, and Wilson said, sure. And then some of the other kids reached out to other people. So we did that project. We also did another project on what is human rights in the 21st century. And we I'm going to wrap this up in about a minute here. So the kids got together with a lot of the top, we took the top scholars who've been presidents of the human rights section. We interviewed them and said, what are human rights issues for you? What is important to you? And then we did a lot of activists. Again, the kids sometimes found the activists. So we interviewed somebody who was a prosecutor at The Hague of the Kosovo war crimes. We have a woman who's president of Georgia right now. We have a lot of other people that we worked in. And what we found out, surprisingly, was that ecocide is the most important thing. That's what they call it, that we're killing the planet. And even the guy who was human rights prosecutor at Kosovo says, it doesn't matter if we prosecute war criminals if we're killing the planet. Now, this was not a topic for human rights when I started out. Certainly it wasn't a topic in 1948 when they did the Universal Declaration. The idea that you have the right to have air that you can breathe, that you have water which is clean. These are things that people took for granted. So one of the things that the students found out when we did this project on human rights is that the basic concept of human rights is shifting. And so I think it's extremely important to do empirical work and move on and know from there. I can't actually see the chat, and I'm going to stop at that point. If you have any questions about how we set up the institution at Irvine to deal with these things and how it kind of is self-supporting at this point, I'm happy to talk about that. Happy to talk about some of the questions that people have about doing research on human rights, especially when you deal with human beings, and that was very interesting for me. So at that point, I'm going to leave it, and I'm happy to take any questions, and anyone who wants to get in touch with me, you can find me on the UCI website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I think one thing that our two speakers have in common is a thread of relevance to real world events. And Manisha Gelman of Emerson College has just been doing work on El Salvador. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Manisha, to talk a little bit about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen and Anne. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so that I put together some photos from my fieldwork in El Salvador over the last 15 years or so to bring some images into the conversation. Let's see if this works. Okay, so can you just see the PowerPoint? Is that clear, John? Yes, wonderful. Okay, let me go ahead and full screen it. So I started doing research in El Salvador after finishing a master's degree in peace and conflict studies. Then I was just down the road from Kristen, although in a different generation of scholars, up at Northwestern University for my PhD, where I was trained in comparative social science. And there is a tension, I think, in Northwestern and political science departments across the country, really, between these strains of positivist and interpretivist approaches to the discipline. And in my work, I have really tried to walk that line. I suppose you could say I try to have my cake and eat it too, because I do theory testing research and I also incorporate interpretivist approaches to the political ethnographic context in which I operate. So I think I just want to briefly show some photos. I started in 2008, 2010, 2012 doing doctoral research in El Salvador, focused on indigenous social movements and the impact of the Civil War on human rights and particularly on gendered rights. And so these are just a handful of photos from sites that I visited as I was documenting the visual landscape of the country, in addition to doing many, many qualitative interviews with people. And this project turned into my first book, which is called Democratization and Memories of Violence: Ethnic Minority Rights Movements in Mexico, Turkey, and El Salvador. So it's a comparative project. I'm focusing just on El Salvador here. I continue to be very involved in my research in Mexico and not quite as much in Turkey, given the political context that's happening there. So I'm happy to talk more about that. But here's just a handful more photos. The one with the people in it is me as a young grad student there with one of my interlocutors and her family. Part of the process of doing human subject research in this mode and political ethnographic mode is spending time with people. And so doing both formal interview components, but also ethnographic work and informal time together. This is in the Morazan region of Northeast El Salvador, which was part of the FMLN stronghold or the leftist stronghold during the Civil War. And also just down the road from the El Mozote massacre that has been in and out of the news since it happened over the last several decades. I did a lot of data collection with these formal qualitative interviews, but also, as I mentioned, just surveying the visual landscape. And I was really interested in the role of murals and art as a way to show Indigenous presence in a country that has, up until 2012, really maintained a narrative that Indigenous people were no longer present in the country, and that El Salvador had become a mestizo or a mixed background country. In fact, there's a very vibrant and ongoing Indigenous presence across different parts of El Salvador. And these murals, to me, constituted a form of evidence of that presence that was not always visible in other channels. And so I took a lot of photos and spent a lot of time looking at different ways that indigeneity was represented when it was not included in census data, for example, or in the formal statistics in state publications about who is Salvadoran. And this is, I think, the last set of images from fieldwork. I also spent a lot of time in a school, multiple schools in El Salvador and in Mexico, looking at the impact of access to Indigenous languages. And I bring this example up because I think it shows how research agendas can shift but maintain common threads over time. So I was very interested in how communities narrativize violence in making rights claims on their state at this point in my early work. And I looked to these schools teaching Indigenous languages as an indicator of a cultural rights arena. But I didn't really get to go in completely to the impact of the education politics scenario that I was just touching on in my first project. And so I ended up doing a second book project, again, with, it ended up having 150 interviews across Mexico and California, as well as a survey component and focus groups looking at the impact of Indigenous languages in those two places, in far northern California and in southern Mexico. And it was really inspired by this early contact with the presence of Indigenous language instruction in El Salvador. The photo on the bottom is with a language keeper of the Nahuatl language, Juliana Chile de Ama, who I was able to go back and visit. I'm going to skip that slide for a second. I was able to go back and visit just this last December, January, when I did a research trip back to El Salvador. And that's her in the bottom photo. I'm giving her a Spanish translation of that I had done of my first book, because there was otherwise no way for the information that I had collected, thanks to her, to be accessible to her. And I also did that. The photos on the top are with members of an Indigenous civil society organization in El Salvador. And so it was really important to me, in terms of the ethics of research, to bring the information that I had collected and distilled back to the communities from whence it came. And in my more recent work, I've focused a lot on collaborative methodologies and how to actually design research in relationship with historically marginalized and contemporarily marginalized communities, rather than what I did here in this early work was extracting information out, analyzing it, and then trying to bring it back, trying to ethically be in relationship with people to return the information. But now I'm trying to take it a step further in some of my work, especially in Northern California and in Southern Mexico. I'll just go back to this slide. I want to highlight that a lot of my work has been on democracy and the way that Indigenous people are rendered visible and invisible. I'm always looking for indicators of the social contract. So what are the rights and responsibilities that people have in relationship to each other and to their states? And as a democratization scholar, I really look to the experience of the regime of most marginalized populations to tell us something about the regime quality. fast forward, I think I was going to ask Karthik to put these links to some of my recent journalistic publications in the chat, because these ones have just come out in the last couple of months since coming back from El Salvador. I've been doing a lot of writing on the current political situation there. And for anyone that's interested, just follow those links. And these 4 publications are all geared towards popular consumption and are open access. So my trip back to El Salvador a couple months ago was really focused on the politics of the state of exception and the human rights implication of the state of exception that's been in place now for almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years next week, under which almost 75,000 people have been arrested and detained. And this is in a context where there has been extreme democratic backsliding, and El Salvador's previously closer to consolidated democratic infrastructure has been eroded under President Nayib Bukele. And there's a culture of denouncement where if people are unhappy with someone, they can denounce them, and that's considered sufficient evidence to detain and incarcerate. And so I think on my next slide, I talk about the fact that I do a lot of expert witnessing in US immigration courts. And so because of my early work on the politics of violence across Mexico and El Salvador, these are places where there are a lot of people fleeing situations of violence based on their particular identities and looking for a path to asylum. And I'm asked by immigration attorneys to serve as an expert witness for the country conditions in both of those countries. And I see immigration court as an arena where there's a role for scholarly research, evidence-based research, to be translated into an applied analysis that can provide some sort of educative mechanism for judges and attorneys on both sides of a given case. A lot of times there is a lack of understanding about the most up-to-date or particular political context for someone with a given identity, and expert witnesses provide more information for members of the court to better understand the dangers that someone might face based on their identity. So I wanted to share this in this webinar because I talk a lot about my work in language politics and formal education sector issues. I talk a lot about college and prison work, which is something else I do. I don't often get to talk about this aspect of my work and the importance of evidence and how indicators of human rights related issues can translate into different kinds of knowledge producing spaces. And I think that when I look at the role of expert witness in this way, it's a really under talked about, that's not the right term. It's a still fairly invisible way in which scholars can take research that they're doing on the ground and apply it in ways that have impact on real life situations. So there's more that I can say, but I can't see the clock while I have this PowerPoint here. So let me stop sharing and be able to go back and see the clock. Yeah, I can leave it there. I think one thing Kristen said that I want to lift up as pertaining to me as well is this question of how do we consider the validity of conflicting claims? We have to do this all the time, regardless of our discipline, regardless of our particular project, considering the validity of conflicting claims in order to not just test, but triangulate our information in a given project to make sure that we're reaching saturation, that we've fully explored all of the angles of a topic, to make sure that our information is accurate, regardless of whether we are theory testing in a positivist mode or interpreting it in an interpretivist mode, is, I think, for me, really the foundation of good social science research. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to dialogue.
Great, thank you both. And I would like to remind attendees that there's a Q&A spot for you to ask questions. And I'm going to start out with one question that's in the spot now, and we'll just go from there. So this question is for both of you, potentially. I would love to hear an example from the panel about a time where your work has had has led you to have to make difficult trade-offs between securing informed consent from participants and extending duty of care for researchers and participants. In conflict research, this issue often comes up where providing full informed consent could put people at risk. So if you have comments, either Manisha or Kristen, on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, can I answer first, Kristen? Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Um, I have an example from this most recent trip to El Salvador because people are under tremendous scrutiny, and the danger that people face means that my own human subject informed consent process looked different than it did in my many previous informed consent IRB processes. So in my work prior, even in situations of political contention, I was still requiring written informed consent where there was a paper trail and people's given names on a piece of paper that I physically had that I, then put into my password protected database, blah, blah, blah. I felt like it was too risky in this context to have that paper link because I wanted to be able to talk to human rights activists. I wanted to be able to talk to people who have loved ones who are detained under the state of exception. And so I asked for and was granted by IRB a waiver of the written consent. So I was able to do an oral consent process. I had my script written for oral consent. So I was still responsible for articulating the full scope of things that are normally in a written IRB informed consent document, but I wasn't requiring people's signatures, and everybody that I spoke to was given a code or a pseudonym upon the time of the meeting. So I have no record of people's given names, and that was something that I negotiated with IRB as a way to recognize that simply speaking with me and having a document linking my research that's publicly available through these various sites, and someone's comments could put someone at risk. So I hold very dear the impact of both potentially traumatizing research. I do a lot of work specifically on trauma-informed research and trauma-informed education more broadly. So I think there's both the implication of informed consent and how do we make sure we are ethically maintaining somebody's physical security in a conflict setting or in a non-democratic regime scenario. But also, are we, in our quest for information, are we potentially endangering people's well-being emotionally by asking things that are overly triggering without having a realistic sequence of resource accesses for them to address after? And if there's interest in that, I'm happy to talk more, but that's just my most recent example. It's a really, really important question. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, I can only second what Manisha just said, and it is an important question. I have a lot of concerns about the IRB. I think that they, I consider myself an ethicist primarily, and I like to think that the standards of treatment for, I hate the term human subjects, that even using that term, they're human beings. And so I've been in situations where some of the, I was in Bosnia, for example, and if you try to talk to somebody in a formal research setting, if you say, I'm doing research on such and such, they totally closed up. This was, maybe 2014 when I was there. And so I realized I couldn't get any information if I were going to go in at a formal scholar who was analyzing things. If I just talked to people in the streets, for example, I got on a plane, I was going back to Italy. The woman who sat next to me, we were kind of joking, would somebody come and sit in the middle seat? Would it be empty? So we started chatting on the plane. She started telling me about her life, what had happened during the Yugoslav, various genocides there, ethnocides. And I said to her about halfway through, can I do research on this? Can I turn on the tape recorder? And she said, yes. But that was only after we talked for about half an hour, and she trusted me. So I've never used that. I've never used it in any formal research because I didn't have a formal consent. And so that's a real tension, I think, because there are some situations where the IRB won't give you consent. They won't give it to you in the way you want. I've had, for example, some of these high school kids, they come to you, they get to know you. there's a kind of the Surgeon General says there's an epidemic of mental health crisis among 12-year-olds and 19-year-olds. So I started talking with some of these kids, and it really helped them to have somebody to talk about. They didn't realize that there are other people that are having pressures from college and the whole process. So we actually put on a module last summer. We called it How to Survive High School and the College Application Process with a Modicum of Mental Stability. And it filled up in 18 hours. It was the fastest module we've ever had done. And so I said to someone, and they wanted to work on it with me. And I said, I can't do research on this because I can't get IRB approval to do research with kids who are under 18. It's a nightmare, as Manisha probably can tell you. So I said, what we can do, if you want to talk about these things, we can talk about them, and I can do you can do your own little interview, and we can publish it as stories, but we can't publish it as a piece of scholarly work. And so I think that's a real tension, because you want to be able to, the whole process, as Manisha and Anne can probably tell you, simply getting involved with people, there's a Heisenberg effect. I mean, you're going in there as an interview, you become someone who's part of their lives. I mean, I have people I'm still close to. I'm close to their children that, Margot's daughter lives in Hamburg, and I visit her every time I go to Germany. And so you're not a researcher, you become a part of a family in many ways. It doesn't happen with everybody, but I think you have ethical obligations to them as human beings that precede and are more powerful than the kind of IRB things. And putting it into an IRB format where you simply cannot go into slums in Indonesia and say, oh, I'd like to talk to you about the government. It's like, if you pull out a piece of paper, you're toast. And so you can't get the information. And I think as a scholar, you have an obligation to try to get implication out. I thought that what Nisha said about people being seen is really important, and you want their voices to be heard. So I think you sometimes have to come up with a creative way to do it, just maybe stories, not a scholarly work. But I think that's really important point that she made. And I think it's just really critical, and the IRB needs to figure out a way to respond a little more realistically to what you have, especially when you're dealing with situations of trauma. And it doesn't have to be, in a third world country where there's a political trauma. I was thinking of a movie that Manisha was talking about, women in journalism, and how Eleanor Holmes Norton said, they can't deny you are allowed to be reporters. And it was like, really? I mean, you need people who can show you that you have human rights that exist and that they're important and are sometimes being violated. And that's, I think, essentially an important role that scholars can fill here.
Can I just add one more thing, Anne, because
Sure.
Kristen mentioned the difficulty of getting IRB approval for studies with minors. And my second monograph, Indigenous Language Politics in the Schoolroom, I did more than 100 interviews with minors, and I have, extensive appendices dedicated to explaining the multiple levels of permission that I had to go through to get that. I actually have a chapter in an edited book that's going to come out next year that talks just about the permissions process, because that was such a huge part of the work that, the years that it took to navigate the multiple levels of permission required to finally be able to get IRB approved research with minors. So it's not for the faint of heart in this context, and I think that Kristen's point of you can do things as stories. Oral history is not, it does not require IRB approval. So there are these problematic but existent loopholes where we can share people's stories, document people's stories in ways that are not trying to generalize information, which is what IRB is required to protect, the generalizability of information in a social science framework as opposed to an oral history or storytelling framework. And we might make choices about our work based on how IRB will view the populations we're wanting to work with. But I so appreciate Nick's question that they had put in the Q&A, the trade-off that can happen in addition to the IRB protocol things I was talking about is also the what we talk about. And I feel this in my work a lot, because there is a proclivity for, to be blunt, trauma porn among researchers. People want to look at the messiest, ugliest, most difficult part of somebody's life or a community situation or a political event and then broadcast that in research. And I think one thing that I am trying to really hold myself accountable with is I don't need to hear every individual person's story of pain in order to see the indicators of a human rights abuse, for example. So when I do interviews with people, and if people are starting to tear up, or it's clear that something is getting close to a source of pain that I don't have the resources to accompany them through, I'm going to change the question and I'm going to look for that information elsewhere, because there might be published studies on the impact of rape or sexual assault for women and girls in a given region. I don't need to have someone tell me that story firsthand when I'm able to get some of the evidence from secondary literature and match that with different kinds of evidence in human research that doesn't require people to put their pain on display in ways that could be overly harmful.
I'm really glad Manisha picked that up. I was going to mention her work. I didn't know if I should put her on the spot, but she's one of the scholars that does really sensitive, very careful work in this area, and it's very important to do. And I had the same kind of thing where there were several times when Margot, this woman I mentioned, had an affair with a Gestapo commander, had talked about it, and I didn't pursue it because I thought it's too personal a question to ask her. I don't want to ask somebody, how could you sleep with this guy? And at some point I said to her, it must have been very difficult for you having a friendship with this guy, with this man. And she says, friendship? Hell, I was sleeping with a guy, and starts telling me all these information. So one of the things that I think I found is if you don't go for the jugular, as Manisha says, you don't pursue the trauma porn, people will sometimes tell it to you in ways that are meaningful for them. But I think you have to kind of not go there and let them come to you if they want to talk about it. And you can get information other ways, but it's very important to treat these people as human beings first and as human research subjects second. So Manisha is a very great example of this, and I recommend that book, especially some of the appendices. It's wonderful.
Great. So it looks like we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. Am I right, John?
Yes, I think that's right. I'd
Yeah.
like to ask a question if
Yes, please.
I don't see any others. I'm looking at the Q&A from the audience. So I'll take advantage of the time. I'm wondering, as you're working with other researchers who may not be scholars, but who are working within the human rights movement, you've come across community-based organizations, NGOs, that also see a role for science in their own work on human rights, gathering evidence. You've spoke to some of this, the role you've played, Manisha, in the courts as a expert witness. It seems increasingly using new digital technologies hitched to science, the science of you call it a human rights science, uncovering human rights evidence, to frame something as a human rights abuse, to provide evidence in other institutions. This is happening all the time. But as these new digital technologies become increasingly a part of the science of studying human rights, what role do you see for political science in particular? I'm coming at this as a political sociologist, usually in the study of human rights. What role do you see for us where we place an emphasis on the practice of human rights as opposed to just the broader international legal approaches to understanding human rights? We know that these digital technologies are often tied to platforms that generate their own human rights abuses. This is documented increasingly. And I guess to what extent we become entangled in this or dependent on some of these technologies for our own methods. What does that mean for us, not just in passing an institutional review board review, but thinking through how we ought to be using these kinds of technologies and methods?
Can I respond briefly? So one of my well, it's become an interest is the ways in which our access to just information about human rights has changed in the few decades that people have been really studying it. So one sort of side project has become, it's something I base some of my research on, is the importance of preserving evidence, not just of human rights abuses, but also for those of us who are interested in how NGOs work or in advocacy attempts, evidence of advocacy. So I've been involved with digitally preserving some of the very old Amnesty International urgent action documents in a way that can be useful for scholars later. So I think that's something that scholars don't think about enough, is ways to collaborate with practitioners on that sort of thing. And I know there's some other aspects to your question, so I'll leave open to my fellow panelists on that.
Kristen, do you want to respond first?
Yes, I just headed an award committee for the International Society of Political Psychology, and one of the prizes that we give is for people who go out into the world and actually further political psychology. So it's not human rights per se, but we gave a joint award this year to someone who they have it's called NOW, it's Narratives of War. It's two people in the Ukraine and one person in Canada who've gone about collecting stories about what the war is like, and they're trying to put them in an archive so anybody can get access to it. So I think that's the type of thing that Anne-Marie is talking about, that scholars can do. They can put this information up and make it available to everybody. We were doing that for a while when I was collecting war stories. We have a little archive at UCI. Anybody can go and get on and get the narratives. I think there are a lot of really interesting ethical and legal problems in what John's raising, and I don't have good answers to that, because on the one hand, you can collect information, you can try to get information, make it available and accessible. But I think, and I was trying to do a kind of social media project this summer, and I thought the legal and ethical questions are really interesting and difficult, and I don't think we've got a good grip on them yet, about how you put information out there, how you know it's reliable information. Are you taking, if you do the Narratives of War project, are you getting somebody that's actually a war criminal, maybe, that's you're giving legitimacy to? So I think there are a lot of complex issues. I don't think we're beginning to deal with these, but I think we're going to have to in the years to come, because you do want to give voice to some of these people, but then how do you certify and know that they're legitimate and what they're saying isn't totally, I mean, we all have bias, but I think there are a lot of complex questions here. I think this is something the association is going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to move much more online than we did before. I mean, just international meetings, I think in some ways are a thing of the past. You need to figure out a way to have meetings like this webinar, where people can be sitting in Illinois and California and Connecticut, and you can still have communication. It's not as good as it might be in person, but the logistics of getting together and the money that's involved in having scholars get together is just astronomical. And we have to use the digital world.
Thank
And
you.
I don't know how we're going to regulate that, but it's an important question.
We have about 1 minute left if Manisha wants to also.
I do. I want to answer the question. I might take 2 minutes. Forgive me
Okay,
if I
that's
take a
fine.
second minute,
I
but
think we can do it.
so your question brings up really important issues. What role for science? I've written quite a bit about this across a range of publications, but when I first approached the Yurok tribe of Northern California, who's become one of my major collaboration partners in research on indigenous language politics, I said, I do political ethnography. I want to do qualitative research. And they looked at me askance, like, that's not citable. That's not helpful for us to reach the benchmarks we have set out for ourselves as a language program. We want a quantitative component. And I was like, okay, I'll go back to my grad school materials and remind myself how to do survey research. And so in the end, I was able to design a more mixed methods approach that included a survey, that included the qualitative research. But there's this perception, certainly among funders in certain sectors, that quantitative, that more scientific approach is more legitimate, and that had filter down to where the Yurok tribe felt like if they were going to take me on as an outside researcher, they wanted to make sure that they were getting something that was perceived as scientific to the people that they would report back to. And part of working in collaboration and not in an extractive way was, me taking on that challenge and being able to ultimately deliver on it in a way that was meaningful. I do think that certainly the way that digital platforms can be beneficial, like Anne, your example is so powerful of digitizing these things that would otherwise be lost in human rights history, is the flip side of that is thinking about the Pegasus spyware infiltration of journalists in El Salvador. So not sure who, maybe the Salvadoran government got Pegasus spyware put on all of these journalists' phones and digital devices. And it was this massive invasion of privacy that happened, massive invasion of human rights, and it had big implications for the freedom of expression. So I think the most important thing is that we're looking critically at how digital platforms are in conversation with human rights issues. When are they undermining them and when are they supporting them? And being able to be really clear with ourselves in why and how we're engaging those sorts of techniques to make sure that we're using them in ways that support rather than undermine human rights.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This was an excellent panel. We're getting thank yous also in our Q&A. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and I know we're going to be getting a lot of comments. I also want to point out this has been recorded, as we pointed out at the beginning. So if any of you who attended want to go back and see this, or you want others to see this who weren't able to attend today, this should be posted on the American Association for the Advancement of Science's YouTube channel in the coming, usually it takes about a week or so before we get all this up, and we should have a transcript with it. Thank you again. We're out of time. Please, panelists, check the chats and see thank yous coming in. And I guess that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.